What drives a man to pour molten silver into the eyes and ears of his enemies? Genghis Khan, the founder of the largest contiguous land empire in human history, didn't just conquer through superior military tactics. He conquered through terror so absolute, so methodically calculated, that entire cities would surrender at the mere mention of his name. But the question that historians have wrestled with for centuries is this: were these torture rituals strategic instruments of war? Or did they reveal something far darker about the man who united the Mongol tribes? Before we dive into the horrifying details that chronicles from Persian, Chinese, and Arab historians have preserved for us, I need you to understand something crucial. These weren't random acts of cruelty, born from rage or madness. Every torture method, every public execution, every calculated act of brutality served a specific purpose in Genghis Khan's grand strategy. And that calculated nature makes them even more disturbing. If you want to understand how power corrupts absolutely, how terror becomes policy, and how one man's vision reshaped the medieval world through systematic horror, then you were in the right place. Subscribe now, because what I am about to reveal goes far beyond what your history textbooks ever dared to mention. Let me start with the execution method that became Genghis Khan's signature. Molten metal executions reserved specifically for rulers and high nobility. This wasn't ordinary execution. This was theater, psychological warfare, and religious symbolism, all wrapped into one horrifying package. When Genghis Khan conquered the Khwarezmian Empire in 1220, he captured Inalchuk, the governor of Otrar, who had made the fatal mistake of executing Mongol ambassadors and confiscating their trade goods. What happened next became legend throughout the medieval world. According to multiple historical sources, including the chronicler Atamalik Juvayni, Genghis Khan ordered molten silver to be poured into Inalchuk's eyes and ears. But here's what makes this even more calculated than simple revenge. Silver was specifically chosen because it represented wealth and trade, the very things Inalchuk had stolen from the Mongol merchants. The symbolism was deliberate. You valued silver more than diplomatic relations, so silver will be your death. The execution took hours. Witnesses reported that Inalchuk's screams could be heard throughout the city. The molten metal destroyed his eyes first, then slowly burned through his ear canals into his brain. Death came slowly, agonizingly, while Mongol officials forced the city's remaining population to watch. This execution method wasn't used randomly. Genghis Khan reserved it specifically for leaders who had betrayed agreements or harmed his ambassadors. The message was clear and traveled faster than any army. Diplomatic immunity is absolute, and violation means death by the very thing you valued over honor. But molten metal executions were just the beginning. Let me tell you about a torture ritual that reveals the true genius and horror of Mongol psychological warfare: the systematic use of prisoners as siege weapons. During the siege of Nishapur in 1221, after the city had killed Genghis Khan's son-in-law, Tokchar, with an arrow, the Khan implemented what historians call the decree of extermination. But before the final massacre, he ordered something that still makes military historians pause in horror. Mongol engineers forced prisoners to construct siege towers and battering rams while under constant arrow fire from the city walls. The prisoners weren't just laborers. They were family members of the defenders. Imagine defending city walls and looking down to see your own father, your brother, your son being forced to build the very weapons that will destroy your home. Do you shoot at the siege equipment and risk killing your family? Do you hold fire and allow the Mongols to breach your defenses? This impossible choice broke the defenders' morale more effectively than any military assault could. But here is the truly calculated cruelty. The Mongols made sure that the defenders could hear the prisoners begging for their lives, pleading with their relatives on the walls to surrender the city. The psychological torture was deliberate and devastating. When cities did surrender under these conditions, The Mongols often executed both the defenders and the prisoners they had used as shields, sending a message that collaboration under duress would not be rewarded. Now, let me tell you about a punishment that seems almost mundane compared to molten metal and human shields, but which reveals perhaps the most chilling aspect of Genghis Khan's character: the methodical use of slow starvation as both punishment and spectacle. After the Mongol conquest of Beijing in 1215, Genghis Khan captured members of the Jin dynasty's royal family. According to Chinese chronicles, he didn't execute them immediately. Instead, he had them placed in wooden cages barely large enough to crouch in, positioned in the center of Mongol camps, where soldiers would pass by constantly. The prisoners were given just enough water to survive, but systematically denied food. The purpose wasn't execution. It was demonstration. Mongol soldiers, many of whom had been nomadic herders just years before, needed to understand that even the mightiest emperors were nothing before the Khan's power. So the royal prisoners were kept alive in their cages for weeks, slowly wasting away while Mongol warriors went about their daily routines mere feet away. The princes who had once commanded armies became living skeletons, their dignity stripped away, their authority revealed as an illusion. But here is what makes this particularly disturbing. Genghis Khan ordered that the prisoners be kept clean and their wounds treated. He didn't want them to die from disease or infection. He wanted them to die from hunger alone, slowly and publicly, while maintaining enough awareness to understand their complete powerlessness. Some prisoners lasted more than 2 months. By the end, they were unrecognizable as human beings, let alone royalty. Let's talk about something that even hardened warriors found difficult to stomach: the practice of forced familial execution. When Genghis Khan conquered a territory, he faced a practical problem. How do you prevent future rebellions from the sons and relatives of defeated leaders? His solution was as brilliant as it was horrifying. He would force fathers to execute their own sons, brothers to kill brothers, creating trauma so deep that survivors lost the psychological capacity to organize resistance. Persian historian Rashid al-Din documented one particularly brutal example during the conquest of Merv in 1221. After the city surrendered, Mongol officials separated families into groups. They would select one member of each family, usually the patriarch, and present him with a choice: execute your eldest son yourself, or watch as we torture every member of your family to death slowly, starting with the youngest children. Most fathers, faced with this impossible choice, chose to grant their sons a quick death rather than subject their entire family to prolonged torture. But here, as the psychological weapon, the Mongols made these executions public. Other families were forced to watch fathers killing sons, brothers killing brothers. The trauma didn't end with death. It continued in the minds of survivors who witnessed these forced betrayals. The Mongols understood something profound about human psychology. Survivors of warfare can recover and rebuild, but survivors who have been forced to betray their own families, who have witnessed fathers turned into executioners, carry wounds that never heal. These broken communities never produced effective resistance movements, because the basic bonds of trust had been shattered beyond repair. Now I need to tell you about a torture method that combined physical agony with religious desecration in ways that terrorized medieval Islamic societies. The destruction of faith through systematic violation. When Genghis Khan conquered Bukhara, one of the great centers of Islamic learning, in 1220, he didn't just sack the city. He implemented a calculated program designed to break the spiritual foundation of the population. The Mongols forced the city's imams and religious scholars into the Grand Mosque. Then, according to Giovanni's chronicles, Genghis Khan himself entered the mosque on horseback. an act of profound desecration in Islamic tradition. But what happened next went far beyond symbolic insult. The Khan ordered the religious leaders to bring out all the holy texts and manuscripts the mosque contained. Then he commanded that these texts be used as fodder for Mongol horses. The scholars were forced to watch as animals trampled and ate the Qurans and Islamic commentaries that represented centuries of scholarship. Here's what makes this particularly calculated. The Mongols didn't just destroy these texts themselves. They forced the religious authorities to participate in the desecration. Scholars were ordered to tear pages from holy books with their own hands and feed them to horses. Those who refused were tied to their own pulpits and burned alive while their books burned with them. The psychological impact on the surviving population was devastating. Their spiritual leaders had been forced to choose between committing unthinkable sacrilege or dying as martyrs. Either way, the authority structure that held Islamic society together was shattered. Survivors lost faith not just in their ability to resist the Mongols, but in the very religious foundations that had defined their identity. Let me tell you about a punishment specifically designed for generals and military commanders who had fought effectively against Mongol forces. The ritual of gradual dismemberment. This wasn't the quick execution that captured soldiers might expect. This was a methodical, multi-day process designed to serve as both punishment and deterrent. When Mongol forces captured enemy generals who had inflicted significant casualties on Mongol armies, they would implement what sources describe as the death of 1,000 cuts, though the Mongol version was even more systematically cruel than the Chinese practice it resembled. The captured general would be secured to a wooden frame in a public location. Then, over the course of days, Mongol executioners would remove small pieces of flesh from non-vital areas, carefully calculated to cause maximum pain while preventing the victim from dying quickly. Arab chronicles describe how executioners would cauterize each wound to prevent fatal bleeding, extending the torture for as long as possible. But here's the strategic element. The Mongols would position these torture frames at crossroads and major routes, ensuring that travelers and messengers would witness the general's slow destruction. The message to other military commanders was clear. Effective resistance will be rewarded not with a warrior's death, but with prolonged agony that strips away all honor and dignity. Some generals lasted 4 or 5 days. Witnesses reported that by the end, the victims would beg for death, promising information or cooperation for a quick end. The Mongols would sometimes grant these requests, but only after the spectacle had served its purpose of terrorizing anyone who might consider military resistance. Now let's discuss something that reveals the systematic nature of Mongol terror: the use of surrender propaganda, backed by horrifying proof. Before attacking a major city, Genghis Khan would send envoys with a simple message: surrender immediately and pay tribute, or face total annihilation. To prove this wasn't an empty threat, the envoys would bring evidence from recently conquered cities. But this evidence wasn't just documents or captured banners. It was physical proof that forced recipients to confront the reality of Mongol brutality. Historical records describe envoys arriving at city gates carrying sacks. When opened, these sacks contained the ears, noses, and sometimes heads of defenders from cities that had resisted. But the Mongols took this psychological warfare further. They would present city leaders with detailed accounts of exactly what had happened to similar cities, describing torture methods in precise detail, including the duration of suffering and the fate of specific individuals. The effect was devastating. City councils would receive these messages and immediately understand that the Mongols weren't making threats. They were describing their standard operating procedure. Many cities surrendered without resistance, not because of military inferiority, but because leaders couldn't bear to subject their populations to the documented horrors that resistance would bring. Here, as what's truly chilling, The Mongols were so systematic that they maintained records of which torture methods had been most effective at inducing surrender in similar cities. They adapted their terror tactics based on cultural context, understanding that what horrified Islamic societies might differ from what terrified Chinese or Russian populations. This wasn't mindless cruelty. It was data-driven psychological warfare. Let me tell you about one final torture ritual that perhaps best encapsulates the combination of cruelty and strategy that defined Genghis Khan's reign. The punishment of the boiling death reserved for those who had betrayed oaths or broken sacred oaths, or broken sacred promises. Mongol society placed immense importance on oath-keeping, codified in Genghis Khan's legal code, the Yasa. When someone violated a solemn oath, the punishment needed to reflect the gravity of breaking sacred bonds. The method chosen was death by boiling, but implemented in a way that maximized both suffering and symbolic meaning. The condemned would be placed in a large cauldron filled with water. The water would be heated slowly, not quickly brought to a boil. This gradual increase in temperature meant the victim remained conscious for much longer, feeling their flesh literally cooking while still alive. According to various historical accounts, the process could take more than an hour, with the victim's screams serving as a warning to anyone who might consider breaking their word to the Khan. But here's the strategic brilliance. The Mongols would conduct these executions in the exact location where the oath had been sworn. If the betrayal involved a treaty signed in a specific tent, that tent would be set up around the boiling cauldron. If the oath had been sworn before a particular shrine or statue, the execution would take place in view of that sacred object. The message was clear. No location is safe from justice, no oath can be broken without consequence, and the punishment will return to the scene of the crime. The systematic nature of these torture rituals reveals something profound about Genghis Khan's approach to conquest. He didn't view brutality as a release of violent impulses, but as a tool to be wielded with precision. Every torture method served a specific purpose: molten metal for diplomatic violations, forced familial execution for breaking family-based resistance, religious desecration for destroying spiritual authority, and so on. Historical evidence suggests that Genghis Khan actually reduced violence in the long term by making initial examples so horrifying that future resistance became unthinkable. Cities that surrendered immediately were often treated relatively well, allowed to keep their property and leadership structures intact, merely required to pay tribute and provide troops. But cities that resisted faced extermination so complete that survivors described the Mongols as a force of nature rather than a human army. Was Genghis Khan a monster? By modern standards, absolutely. But in the context of 13th century warfare, he was a strategic genius who understood that terror could accomplish what armies alone could not. He built the largest land empire in history not primarily through military superiority, but through calculated cruelty that made resistance seem futile. The question we were left with is uncomfortable. If systematic torture can achieve strategic objectives, if calculated cruelty can prevent larger wars, does that make such methods justifiable? Genghis Khan would have answered yes without hesitation. He saw himself as bringing order to a chaotic world, and if that order required horrifying methods, so be it. Today, the Mongol Empire is long gone, but its methods influenced how warfare and statecraft were conducted for centuries. The principle that terror can be a strategic tool, that calculated cruelty can achieve political objectives, did die with Genghis Khan. It evolved, adapted, and continues to appear in various forms throughout history. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Were Genghis Khan's torture rituals necessary strategic tools? Or did they cross a line that no objective can justify? And what does it say about human nature that these methods were so effective at achieving their goals. If this video made you think differently about how empires are built and power is maintained, subscribe to this channel. We explore the uncomfortable truths of history that textbooks often sanitize or ignore. Hit that subscribe button, because understanding the darkness of the past is the only way to recognize when it starts emerging in our own time.